Greetings, beloved. What a chapter. Dear Lazarus. Lazarus is famous for his death. Have you thought about that? There's only 2 verses about his resurrection from the dead or his being raised from the dead, but there's 41 verses about his death. We have to try to read this story as if we don't know the ending. For 41 verses, the family is turned inside out because of grief. Lazarus was way too young to die. And you really get a sense of that in the tenacity of the sisters in begging Jesus to come and come quickly. Lazarus is also famous for not saying anything. The chapter could be called The Silence of Lazarus. Maybe he can't get a word in edgewise. Maybe he's just too sick to speak. Maybe he doesn't say anything because for most of the chapter, he is dead. And dead men don't speak. But even when he comes out of the tomb, you'd expect at least a word, a sigh, some comment. Like, "Hi, Jesus," or "I wasn't expecting this." But nothing. Now, some of you are probably saying, "Okay, Brian, yes, Lazarus doesn't say anything, and Lazarus was dead for most of the chapter, but really he's the most famous because he was raised from the dead." Okay, I'll give you that, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's live for a moment in the great grief and sadness of his death. We don't like doing this. In our culture, we have sanitized death and we have domesticated it. Very few of us ever spend much time with a dead person. This is something that was very different from times gone past. We have a way of removing the body quickly and making sure that it gets placed in a nicely padded casket and then laid in an air-conditioned funeral home. And even when we talk to people about the death of our loved ones, we have other words to use so we don't have to use the word death. My mother has passed, or my father has passed. The story opens with this statement. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick, and the sickness of this dear man elicits the response of his loving sisters, who are more famous than Lazarus, Mary and Martha. We've already heard about them. And what we learned from the sisters is that their brother is not only famous because he was dead and eventually came to life, but he was famous because he was so loved. When they send the prayer request to Jesus, they don't even need to use his name. They just say, "Lord, the one that you love is sick." That would suffice. Jesus would know exactly who they were talking about. And then in verse 5, it says that Jesus loved Martha and her sister Mary and Lazarus. And we rejoice in that. We rejoice that when we are going through grief, that Jesus draws near to us and he loves us and he loves the deceased. But we are afraid of verse 6. We're afraid because it says when Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And we don't know why at first he does this, but it has something to do with God's glory. Later he says, "Did I not say to you, if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" That through the sickness and death of Jesus' very close friend, the true character of God was going to be revealed to the world. And so Jesus delays. And as a result, verse 14 is very clear and uses no modern euphemisms. Lazarus is dead. Let's talk about the sisters and their grief for a moment. It says that the sisters are perplexed. Perplexity is one of the stages of grief. The one who turned water into wine at the wedding feast and the one who healed all kinds of people that he didn't even know for some strange reason bypasses the healing of Lazarus. He lets his friend die. And this is perplexing. Jesus knew that his friend was sick and he had the power to heal him, but he chooses not to. And this is a very common narrative. A number of years ago, when I was preaching on the raising of Lazarus, there was a woman right across the street from us who was in her 30s, and she had a young son who was about 7. And she was on her deathbed, and she died that spring. This is my story, and it's your story. We all have loved ones who have died before they're 70. And we shouldn't be cavalier about these losses in our lives. These losses shape our lives. We're never the same after losing a child, or a young mother, or father, or a sibling, or even a close friend. These deaths wound us, and they leave us with deprivations and with deep open wounds. Death is a cruel enemy. And our text tells us that in verse 19 that the whole Hebrew community around Jerusalem came to Bethany. They came to the aid of Mary and Martha to comfort them in their great loss, because everybody knew that this wasn't an old man in his 90s that died. This was a young man. He was the only man in this family. And so when Jesus finally arrives on the scene, Martha does not hold back. She runs down to meet Jesus, and she has some questions for him. She needs some answers. Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. What's up? We know that you can heal people. And later Mary asks the same question, and the text says that when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Just a quick word on this. In our culture, we really have nothing that resembles the kind of mourning and grief that first century Jews experienced in Palestine. They would rend their clothes and put ashes on their head, and they would weep and wail for days. A funeral lasted 7 days. They would be together with the body of the departed one. And today we just know nothing about this at all. The Apostle John wants the readers to understand that when Jesus arrived on day 4, it was significant because the Jews also believed that for the first 3 days after a person died, the spirit of that person hovered around the body, and it wasn't until day 4 that the person was completely dead. I know it sounds crazy, but this is what they believed. Jesus made sure that he arrived after everyone knew that should Lazarus get raised from the dead, that it wasn't resuscitation, it was resurrection. And while they were en route to the grave of Lazarus, Jesus joined his weeping with theirs. I find this incredible that Jesus knew what he was going to do, but he was still so deeply moved by what had happened. He mingled his tears with theirs. The famous verse, "And Jesus wept." In our deep losses, Jesus continues to weep with us. We become one in the fellowship of his sufferings. When we lose our dear ones, he listens to our complaints. He is not turned off by our 4-letter words. He walks with us to the cemetery plots where we are about to bury our loved ones. But there's something different about the weeping of Jesus. Let's pick up with his discussion with Martha. "Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. But I know," she said, "that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Now, personally, I don't think that Martha had a clue that Jesus was about to raise her brother from the dead right then and there. And I think we can conclude that because when Jesus asked them to move the stone away, the sister said, "Oh, no, don't do that. He's been dead for 4 days. He's not coming back to life now." I would have thought exactly the same thing, but Martha was confident that whatever God would do, he would do the right thing in Jesus. She was a great woman of faith. And Jesus said to Martha, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha answers, "Oh, yes, Lord, I'm aware of that. In the future, on the final day, of course he will rise again. He will rise with all of us." The Jews believed, just like Christians believe, that when Jesus comes, when the Messiah would finally come, that all the dead would be physically raised from the dead. And this now, upon this statement of Martha's, this becomes an occasion for the greatest self-disclosure of Jesus Christ. And I find it just amazing that he makes the statement to Martha, a woman that has been unnecessarily maligned because she is not more like her theologically astute sister Mary. This is Martha's greatest moment. Jesus declares to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die." Do you believe this, Martha? What Jesus has just said to Martha is staggering. He's saying, look, I not only have the power to raise the dead, but I am the resurrection and the life. So this event that you talk about that's going to happen, well, that event has now taken place in me, in my incarnation. I am everything you long for in the future. The coming kingdom is here and now in me. He makes a statement that there is life beyond the grave, and it is in Jesus. That death is not the last word because of Jesus. And this resurrection life of Jesus can begin right now, even before we die. And Martha then responds with a confession of faith that is so clear it rivals even that of Peter's. She declares, "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was come into the world." Let me amplify. I believe that you are the long-awaited Messiah, the anointed one, God's eternal Son, made manifest in the world, incarnated now in human flesh. I find this encouraging on so many levels that Martha, the woman who was rebuked by Jesus because she was worried about so many things, the woman famous for working in the kitchen while her more famous sister Mary sat at Jesus' feet, this is now the woman who was engaging Jesus in the deepest theological discussion imaginable. Who Jesus is and why the resurrection is so central to the gospel message. Remember, I commented on the weeping of Jesus, how it was different. Well, the text says that he was deeply moved and troubled in spirit. And the Greek translation of this depicts the Lord's anger snorting like that of a horse. That when Jesus wept and he was deeply moved, it wasn't just a sad weeping, but it was an angry weeping. He was angry at death itself and the agony that death left in its wake. And so when he arrives at the tomb, it says he is once more deeply moved. And when the stone is finally moved away, foreshadowing another stone that would be moved on Easter Sunday, Jesus addresses his dead friend directly. He doesn't whisper or plead. No, in a loud voice, the text says, with a shout of undiluted authority, Jesus commands Lazarus to come forth. And he does. Death has met its match. Imagine if we would have been there to see it. At the command of Jesus, the grave gives up its prisoner. And this will happen someday in a permanent way with every single one of us. This is why we placed on my dad's tomb, not very far from here, the simple message, awaiting resurrection. And a few days later, from this moment on Passover Friday, Jesus would be the one in death's grip. He would be the one whose body would be lying on a cold stone table. Why? Because he chose to lay down his life in crucifixion for us. But it was only Friday. Sunday was a coming.